Although viewed as disturbing, wrong or immoral, aggression has been part of human behaviour in all cultures past or present. But what is it that makes us feel the need to be verbally or physically aggressive towards others? Is there some sort of evolutionary hangover in which we feel like we need to protect our resources? Is it a chemical imbalance that distinguishes one aggressive individual from another? Or can we explain aggression better using behavioural theories and the environment and learning? It's these questions and others that we'll be exploring while looking at the topic of aggression. First off then, we'll be looking at social psychological approaches to explaining aggression, and this will cover areas that you should have covered in AS. That includes social learning theory, so learning through others, de-individuation, where people perform aggressive acts when hiding behind the guise of a group or a mask. We watched a good video of this, the Derren Brown game show experiment. And then finally, institutional aggression, and that looks at where people perform aggressive acts because of a particular institution that they're in. So we'll look at prisons, for example. We'll then go on to some biological explanations of aggression, so looking at neural pathways and neurochemicals and some hormones that might be involved in aggression. And then onto some genetic explanations as well, so look at some twin studies, the difference between maybe monozygotic and dizygotic. We'll finally finish up then with looking at evolutionary explanations in terms of maybe in relationships and jealousy and how that could cause aggressive behaviour in humans, and finish up by looking at evolutionary group displays in terms of maybe in sporting events, think the haka for the New Zealand rugby team, and then look at maybe war and some applications of that. First off then, social learning theory, and this is obviously a bit different to our operant and classical conditioning, which are your standard behavioural theories, in that social learning theory more explains how we learn through others. So it's not direct learning like you'd learn through classical conditioning. We're talking Pavlov's dogs, learning through association, or the reward and punishment as spoke about by operant conditioning. This is where individuals would learn through observing and imitating behaviour. So if they say a behaviour that produces a desirable outcome, that would be more likely to be imitated. If they observe a behaviour that produces an undesirable outcome, then they're less likely to then do that behaviour. So it's not directly experiencing the behaviour themselves, it's seeing what others do. And this behaviour is more likely to be followed if the people that they are observing tend to be role models. They can identify with them, so it's someone of maybe the same age, the same gender, someone that they look up to. That is where social learning theory and social learning is really at its peak. This would have obvious applications to what is observed maybe at home or at school by children. They're then likely to repeat that behaviour again if it's something that behaviour that they want to, or an outcome that they want themselves. They would be more likely to repeat that behaviour. And it has applications as well in terms of films and TVs. Every time the new Call of Duty comes out, there's always a discussion as to whether it's making kids more aggressive or not. Rather than positive or negative reinforcement, this is then known as vicarious reinforcement, so learning by the outcomes of others' behaviours. And it's clear that it's both the behaviour and the consequence that is going to be repeated. They would repeat the behaviour to get the desirable consequence that they've seen. It should follow quite naturally then that this can be applied to aggression. So if children observe people being aggressive and they're getting their own way, they're getting that something that the child wants, then that behaviour is going to be repeated. And so maybe if children are in the presence of bullies and they see them getting toys or social praise that they then want, they would then copy that behaviour. This is the theory that was then applied by Albert Bandura in his famous Bobo doll experiment, and that's exactly what he was trying to test, whether children would learn through observation to be aggressive. There's been a great Michael Mosley film on this from BBC 2 production called The Brain, A Secret History, of which the clip here should demonstrate exactly what we're looking at in terms of aggression. So let's have a look at this and see what we make of it.
Watson had shown that emotions are learnt, and Harlow that we are intensely social creatures. So it was natural to put these two ideas together and ask how much of what we do and feel is learnt from other people. In 1961, American psychologist Albert Bandura set out to see how far just watching other people influences our behaviour. Bandura chose to study aggression. At the time, the widespread view was that watching violence reduces aggression. It purges us. But was this true? To find out, Bandura experimented on small children, aged 3 to 5. So what Bandura did is he put an adult in a room with a child and a bunch of toys, including something he called the Bobo doll, which is a giant inflatable doll. Then what happened after about a minute, the adult unexpectedly started beating up the doll in really quite a vicious manner, shouting, screaming, kicking, hitting with a hammer, and went on like this for about 10 minutes. What would the child do if after watching the adult they were left in a room on their own with the same toys? Ooh, she really is going for it. She's doing exactly the same as she saw the adult do. She's lifted the doll up and now she's really hammering it. She's got a little hammer out and she's having a go at its toes now. Shows innovation, if nothing else. Every child who watched the adult being violent copied much of what they'd seen. The closest imitation was when a child observed an adult of the same sex. Now he's got a gun out and he's using that, a combination of the gun and the hammer, to just whack the doll. He's got a very aggressive expression on his face. Importantly, another group who had watched an adult play gently played calmly, showing no signs of aggression. Basically, what the children saw, the children did. This was an utterly unexpected finding. Before Bandura did this experiment, psychologists thought that seeing somebody else acting out a violent scene would be cathartic, it would sort of purge you. But what this clearly demonstrated, and really shocked people at the time, is that actually what happens when you see something doing violent actions, you tend to imitate them. Bandura's findings were given added impact by his timing. His experiment took place just as television was moving into the home. 2 years later, Bandura reran his experiment with one important difference. This time, he wanted to compare how children react to watching an aggressive adult, not in real life, but on film. Children watched two versions. One was a straightforward recording of the adult beating up the Bobo doll. The second, a fantasy version, with the attacking adult dressed as a cat. In almost every case, Bandura got the same results. Children imitated what they'd seen. The results were dynamite. This was one of the first experiments to look at the impact of television violence. The complicated relationship between TV and behaviour is still being debated. But it was Bandura who opened the floodgates and launched an entirely new area of research.
Right, okay, have an on.
Bandura had shown that we can be strongly influenced by other people's behaviour. This is the basis of so-called social learning theory.
We didn't have a bowl.
Okay, so
How
we
much?
measure out about 4 ounces, I think.
Which one's ounces? Quarter one.
That's one.
But it's also clear that how we learn changes as we mature. As we grow up, something else happens to temper our behaviour. We develop a capacity to reflect on what we see. We identify with other people.
Sweet tooth. There you go.
We develop empathy.
Tastes good.
It's good, isn't it?
Okay then, as a recap of what we've looked at already, and looking from that video, the theory from the social learning point of view suggests that aggression comes from imitating aggressive acts from others, and you are then vicariously reinforced from doing so. The support for that was then that Bandura study, the Bobo doll study, where they found that children who observed others being aggressive would also be aggressive themselves. And so that's one way of explaining why aggression may occur. So what we need to do now then is look at evaluating this theory and seeing whether it's any good or not. What are the supporting points, and maybe what are some of the criticism or weaknesses against it. Starting with strengths then, one of the biggest strengths is individual differences. So this theory can account for why one individual may be more aggressive than another individual, or why one group of people may be more aggressive than another group of people. And that'll all be down to what they've observed and what they've seen as successful in terms of getting their desired outcomes for aggression. So people may respond differently in different situations because they have observed the aggression being rewarded in some situations and not in others. And so that's one of the big strengths here, talking about looking at why individuals could be aggressive or not. This theory really does explain. Another strength of the theory is that it can account for the role of vicarious reinforcement. Obviously, individuals here don't have to have been directly rewarded for acting aggressively. So it's not as though they've punched someone and got something they wanted, or stolen someone's toy and got something they wanted. They have learnt this through imitation, and the social learning theory can account for that, whereas other theories might not be able to account for how that could happen, such as operant and classical conditioning, how that can happen without direct learning. So that's a good strength. Okay, the next point I have is to do with demand characteristics and the validity of the study. Were they actually measuring what they intended to measure? Was Bandura in his Bobo doll study measuring what he intended to measure? Although I have this next to weakness, it's actually more of a discursive point that you need to be aware of here. So the validity of the study has been questioned in terms of the demand characteristics. Were the children in that study aware of what they had to do? In which case that could have affected the results. In fact, Noble in 1975 had reported that as one of the children approached the study and went into the laboratory and saw the Bobo doll, said, "Look, mummy, there's the doll we have to hit." And so obviously that suggests that they may have been responding to what they were expected to do in the study rather than actually being aggressive because they saw another person being aggressive. So that would take away from the results of the study. There's also the issue that they were hitting a doll, a clown that couldn't hit back. What would happen if they actually had to hit someone that could hit back? Well, as retaliation to the criticism that was put on Bandura in terms of the demand characteristic, he carried out another study and showed children a video of a live clown being beaten up, and then put the children in the room with the live clown, and of course they then went on to kick him, punch him and hit him with the hammers that they saw. So that actually goes against the criticism that there were demand characteristics and suggests that actually the study did have the validity that they wanted to. So you should be able to see how this is more of a discursive point than necessarily a weakness. Okay, another evaluative point looks at the applications of the Bandura study. So obviously that was a study done with children on blow-up inflatable clowns. Can those results actually really help us explain why people are aggressive in crowd? Think of football violence, fights, even acts of war and bigger things. Can that really be applied to that? And you may question that, and so you have to provide some commentary on the fact that the results might not be applicable. In contradiction to that, Phillips suggested that actually the results maybe were applicable, and Phillips in 1986 found that murder rates in the USA almost always increased the week following a major boxing match, which would then suggest that obviously people are watching this boxing match, seeing the aggressive acts, and that's promoting them to act aggressive. And so that's practical, real-world applications to the theory, and it would suggest, well, maybe, although on the face of it it doesn't look like it can be applied, actually there's some real-world evidence to show that it can be. The final point I'm going to discuss then is to do with ethical considerations. Researchers have been intentionally exposing children to situations which are aggressive, in the knowledge that they may then copy these aggressive acts. So there's an issue there in terms of ethical guidelines with protection from harm, and it means that studies involving the social learning theory and aggression are now quite hard to test, because since the Bobo doll experiment, ethical considerations have potentially been tightened up, which makes it harder to get clearance to do these sorts of tests, and means that it's harder then to put this theory into practice and actually test the theory, which takes away from some of the credibility of the theory because of the ethical situation when the first study was done, which again is definitely an evaluative point. Okay, so that's the social learning theory of attachment done. Next up will be de-individuation before we start looking at institutions and biological explanations. Thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned to the channel for more of the videos.